Daniel Matthews leaned against the kitchen counter, his hands gripping a cold mug of coffee. His mind buzzed with thoughts that refused to settle. It wasn't just a bad day. It was a storm brewing inside him, an unshakable feeling that something in his life was unraveling. His wife, Vanessa, had been distant. Not just distant, evasive. Her once vibrant laughter that filled their home had been replaced with distracted smiles. Her phone, once left carelessly on counters, now seemed glued to her side, notifications muted. "You're overthinking," he muttered to himself. But the weight in his chest wouldn't lift. The first sign had come a week ago, when she'd arrived home late from work. "Long meeting," she had said, avoiding his gaze. Daniel had wanted to believe her. He really had. But her explanation had felt rehearsed, her tone too casual to mask the tension in her voice. Then there was the scent. A faint, unfamiliar perfume clung to her clothes, sweet and floral, nothing like the crisp, citrusy scent she usually wore. When he asked about it, she laughed nervously. "A coworker's perfume must have rubbed off," she had said, brushing it off as nothing. Daniel had nodded, but doubt began to seep into the cracks of his trust. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday evening. Vanessa had gone out, claiming she needed to run errands. Daniel, restless and unable to focus on his work, decided to clean the house, a task he usually avoided. In the bedroom closet, while rearranging a stack of winter clothes, his hand brushed against something odd. Tucked behind a shoebox, he found a small bag. His brow furrowed as he opened it, revealing intimate items that didn't belong to their relationship. His breath hitched. This wasn't like her. At least, it hadn't been before. Daniel's hands trembled as he shoved the bag back into the closet and slammed the door. His heart raced, pounding like a drumbeat in his ears. His mind screamed at him to confront her. But another voice whispered a crueler thought: what if you're wrong? What if you ruin everything over a misunderstanding? He resolved to wait. To watch. To be sure. Days turned into nights of restless suspicion. Every smile Vanessa gave him felt forced. Every touch felt hollow. Her excuses to leave the house grew more frequent. One evening, as Daniel parked his car after a long day at work, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Across the street, at the edge of a dimly lit park, Vanessa sat in a car with someone. Their heads were close together, silhouettes illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. Daniel's stomach twisted as he squinted, trying to make out the other person. His colleague, Michael. The betrayal hit him like a sledgehammer. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He sat frozen in his car as the scene played out before him. A hand reached out, a touch, a connection he had thought was his alone to share with her. His world cracked. Daniel drove away before he could do something he'd regret. His grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles turned white. Tears blurred his vision, but he refused to let them fall. Not yet. The seed of vengeance was planted that night. If Vanessa wanted to betray him, he wouldn't let her get away unscathed. Daniel spent the next few days in a haze of quiet rage and simmering determination. He couldn't confront Vanessa, not yet. He needed more than a fleeting glimpse in a car. He needed proof. Cold, undeniable evidence. The house felt suffocating. Vanessa's cheerful demeanor grated against his nerves. Every time she kissed him good morning or asked how his day had been, Daniel felt the urge to shout, to demand answers. But he held back, masking his emotions behind a tight smile. One evening, when Vanessa excused herself to visit a friend, Daniel seized the opportunity to investigate. He started with her phone. Vanessa always took it with her, but she wasn't as cautious with her laptop. Daniel opened it, heart pounding. It was locked. He hesitated for a moment, then tried her usual password, their wedding anniversary. No luck. He frowned, trying to think. Then it hit him, her mother's birthday. He typed it in, and the screen unlocked. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Vanessa's emails seemed ordinary at first glance, but a flagged message caught his eye. The subject line read, "Looking forward to our next meeting." Daniel clicked it open, his heart sinking as he read the exchange. It was subtle, coded, even, but unmistakable. The emails referenced shared plans and inside jokes, and one line stood out. "The car is always a safe spot." His suspicions were no longer doubts. They were facts. Later that night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The image of Vanessa with Michael in the car replayed in his mind, twisting the knife deeper. He needed to act. But how? He decided to follow her. The next time Vanessa left for one of her mysterious errands, Daniel trailed her car at a safe distance. His heart raced as she drove to a quiet parking lot near an office building. There, in the dim light of a street lamp, he saw her step out of the car and into Michael's. The two of them sat close, their conversation animated. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. Then it happened. Michael leaned over, and Vanessa let him kiss her. The betrayal was complete. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard he thought it might break. But instead of confronting them, he drove away. Confrontation wasn't enough. He needed to do more. Something that would hurt as deeply as he was hurting. At home, Daniel's anger simmered into a cold, calculating resolve. He began to plan. He wanted them to feel the weight of their actions. But as he considered his options, he realized he needed to be cautious. Vanessa was good at hiding things, so were others, it seemed. He decided to dig further. If she could betray him with Michael, what else might she be hiding? Days later, he found something that made his blood freeze all over again. Daniel had installed a discreet tracking app on Vanessa's phone, giving him access to her locations and messages. What he discovered was shocking. One evening, Vanessa wasn't with Michael. She was at a nearby coffee shop. When Daniel arrived, he parked outside and scanned the windows. He expected Michael. Instead, he saw someone else entirely. His sister, Rachel. Daniel watched in stunned silence as Vanessa and Rachel shared an intimate conversation. Their body language was familiar, even affectionate. Then Vanessa reached across the table to take Rachel's hand. Daniel's breath caught. Was this what it looked like? When Rachel leaned in to kiss Vanessa, there was no denying it. The betrayal wasn't just his wife's. It was his sister's. The fury that had burned within him turned ice cold. This wasn't just an affair, it was an insult, a mockery of everything he held sacred. His trust had been shattered by the two people he had loved most. Daniel drove home in silence, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just witnessed. Revenge was no longer a fleeting thought. It was a promise. Daniel's mind raced as he sat in his quiet, dimly lit living room. The revelation about Vanessa and Rachel left him feeling unmoored, as though the foundation of his life had been ripped out from under him. Betrayal was one thing, but this? His sister? For the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to cry. Silent, bitter tears traced down his cheeks as he gripped the armrest of the couch. He wasn't sure if he was grieving the loss of his marriage, his trust in family, or the man he thought he was, one who could have seen this coming. But the storm inside him refused to settle. Tears gave way to icy determination. He wouldn't let this go unanswered. They needed to understand what their choices had cost him. Over the next week, Daniel kept his emotions in check and his suspicions to himself. If Vanessa noticed a change in his behavior, she didn't say anything. Rachel, too, seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. She stopped by their house one afternoon to drop off a casserole for dinner. "Thought you'd like a break from cooking," she said with a warm smile. Daniel managed a strained "thanks," and watched as she left, the sight of her walking away filling him with a mix of sorrow and rage. That night, as he and Vanessa sat at the dinner table eating Rachel's casserole, Daniel's stomach churned. The meal felt like a mockery, a twisted symbol of the closeness they all once shared. Vanessa spoke about her day as if nothing was wrong, but Daniel barely heard her. Instead, he focused on his plan. The next morning, Daniel took a day off work, claiming he needed a mental health break. In truth, he needed time to put his plan into motion. He started with Vanessa's car. Armed with gloves and a sharp eye, he searched every inch of the vehicle. In the glove compartment, he found a receipt for a hotel room booked a week ago. The date coincided with one of her errand nights. Perfect, he muttered, pocketing the evidence. He wasn't done yet. Daniel went through Rachel's social media accounts, looking for connections and patterns he might have missed before. While Rachel's posts seemed innocent, her tagged photos told a different story. In one picture, Rachel and Vanessa stood close together at a bar, their arms around each other. The caption read, "My favorite person." Daniel stared at the screen, his anger bubbling to the surface. How had he been so blind? Over the next few days, Daniel pieced together their movements and messages. His meticulous tracking left no room for doubt. They had been carrying on their affair for months, deceiving him at every turn. When he was ready, he set his trap. On a Saturday afternoon, Daniel suggested that he and Vanessa host a dinner party for Rachel and a few mutual friends. "It's been a while since we all got together," he said, keeping his tone light. Vanessa hesitated but agreed. "That sounds nice. We could use a fun night." Daniel smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Great. Let's make it memorable." The night of the dinner arrived, and their home was filled with laughter and conversation. Vanessa flitted around, playing the perfect hostess, while Rachel charmed the guests with her wit and humor. Daniel played his part well, too, engaging in small talk and making sure everyone's glasses were full. But underneath his calm exterior, his heart pounded with anticipation. As the evening wore on, Daniel suggested a toast. "To family, friends, and honesty," he said, raising his glass. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Vanessa and Rachel exchanged a brief, nervous glance, but the moment passed quickly. Daniel waited until dessert to deliver the first blow. As the guests chatted, he brought out the hotel receipt he'd found in Vanessa's car. Holding it up for everyone to see, he said, "Vanessa, I think you forgot this." The room fell silent. Vanessa's eyes widened, her face draining of color. What are you doing, Daniel?" "Oh, just sharing a little something I found," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "It's from that night you had errands. You remember, don't you?" The tension in the room was palpable. The guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. Rachel's face turned red as she avoided Daniel's gaze. "Don't worry, Rachel," Daniel said, turning his attention to her. "I didn't forget about you. I have something for you, too." He pulled out printed screenshots of their messages and photos, tossing them onto the table. Vanessa and Rachel froze, their betrayal laid bare for all to see. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. Vanessa and Rachel sat frozen, their faces pale as they stared at the evidence Daniel had thrown on the table. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Daniel, please. Let's talk about this privately." "Privately?" Daniel's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Why should I? You didn't seem too concerned about privacy when you were sneaking around with my sister." Gasps rippled around the table. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure whether to intervene or leave. Rachel opened her mouth to speak but seemed at a loss for words. Finally, she stammered, "Daniel, this isn't what you think." "Don't," Daniel snapped, his eyes flashing. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen enough. The messages, the photos, the hotel receipts. I know exactly what this is." Vanessa stood abruptly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not that simple," she cried, her voice cracking. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Daniel interrupted. "I trusted you. I built a life with you. And you tore it apart for what?" "For him first." He jabbed a finger toward an empty chair, referencing Michael. "And then for her?" He turned his gaze to Rachel, his voice dripping with contempt. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears. "Daniel, I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did." Daniel's voice rose, the anger he had suppressed for weeks finally boiling over. "You betrayed me, Rachel. You're my sister. How could you do this to me?" The guests began to murmur, some quietly excusing themselves to leave. One of Daniel's closest friends, Alex placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe we should clear out, Alex said gently. Daniel shook his head. No. Let them stay. Let everyone see what betrayal looks like. Vanessa stepped closer to him, her voice pleading. Daniel, we can fix this. I made a mistake, but I love you. We can get through this. Daniel laughed bitterly. Love? Don't you dare use that word. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't sneak around behind someone's back. Whatever this is, it's not love. Rachel finally found her voice. Daniel, I know you're angry. I know you hate me right now. But this wasn't planned. It just happened. Daniel stared at her, his expression cold. It just happened? That's your excuse? You didn't trip and fall into months of lying, Rachel. You made a choice. Both of you did. He took a deep breath, his next words calm but chilling. And now, you'll face the consequences. Vanessa's eyes widened. What do you mean? Daniel pulled a folder from a nearby shelf and slammed it on the table. I've been preparing for this. Divorce papers, he said, glaring at Vanessa. I want you out of this house by the end of the week. Her lip trembled as she stared at the folder. Daniel, please. No, he cut her off. You had your chance. You threw it away. Turning to Rachel, he said. And you. Don't think for a second that I'll let this slide. You're not welcome here anymore. Don't come to me when you need help, because you won't get it. Rachel flinched as if he'd struck her. Daniel, you're my brother. I'm sorry. I never wanted. You wanted what you wanted, Rachel, he said coldly. And now you've lost me. Vanessa sobbed, collapsing into a chair. Rachel sat silently, tears streaming down her face. Daniel, his resolve unshaken, turned to the few remaining guests. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But this party is over. One by one, the guests left, murmuring their goodbyes and casting sympathetic glances at Daniel. Alex lingered for a moment, his brow furrowed with concern. If you need anything, call me, he said quietly. Daniel nodded, his eyes distant. Thanks, Alex. When the house was finally empty, Daniel stood in the silent dining room, staring at the wreckage of the night. Plates of half-eaten dessert and empty wine glasses littered the table, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Vanessa and Rachel sat on opposite ends of the room, their tear-streaked faces a stark contrast to the confidence they had displayed earlier. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Get out. Vanessa looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel, I have nowhere to go tonight. That's not my problem, he said coldly. Call Michael. Call a hotel. I don't care. Just leave. Rachel stood, her movements slow and hesitant. Daniel, please, don't do this. We can fix this as a family. Daniel turned to her, his face hardened. Family? Don't talk to me about family. You killed that the moment you decided to betray me. Vanessa and Rachel exchanged a helpless glance, but neither of them argued further. Slowly, they gathered their things and left, the door closing behind them with a heavy finality. Daniel sank into a chair, exhaustion overtaking him. The house was quiet now, but the weight of what had transpired hung in the air. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life, but he knew the road ahead would be long and painful. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Justice had been served, at least in part. The days following the dinner party were heavy with silence. Daniel, alone in the house, wandered through the rooms as if they belonged to someone else. Every corner held memories of a life he thought he knew, a life that had been shattered. Vanessa moved out the day after the confrontation. She didn't fight him, didn't beg for another chance. She packed her things quietly while Daniel watched from the doorway, his arms crossed and his face expressionless. The only words exchanged between them were logistics, bank accounts, keys, and the pending divorce. Rachel, too, stayed away. Whether out of guilt or shame, Daniel didn't care. She'd sent him a few messages, long, apologetic texts that he refused to read. They remained unopened on his phone, reminders of the sister he had lost. At work, Daniel kept his head down. Michael avoided him entirely, though Daniel noticed the man's nervous glances from across the office. Rumors had already begun to circulate. The tight-knit nature of their workplace meant it was only a matter of time before the story spread. Daniel didn't care about the gossip. What mattered to him was rebuilding his life, piece by piece. One evening, a week after the confrontation, Daniel received an unexpected visit. His mother, Clara, showed up at his doorstep, her face etched with concern. "I've been trying to get a hold of Rachel," she said as Daniel let her in. "She's not answering my calls." Daniel stiffened. "Maybe she's busy." Clara gave him a pointed look. "Daniel, what's going on? She's never avoided me like this before." He hesitated. Telling his mother the truth would mean ripping open the wound again, but he couldn't keep it hidden forever. "Sit down," he said quietly. As Daniel recounted the events of the past few weeks, Clara's face shifted from confusion to shock, then to heartbreak. "Vanessa and Rachel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "I saw it with my own eyes, Mom. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there." Clara covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "Oh, Daniel. I'm so sorry." "I don't need apologies," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to move on." Clara reached for his hand. "Rachel made a terrible mistake. But she's still your sister. Maybe with time. There's no coming back from this." Daniel interrupted, pulling his hand away. "She knew what she was doing. She knew what it would do to me, and she did it anyway." Clara stayed for hours, trying to console him, but Daniel's resolve was unshakable. When she finally left, he felt no relief, only the dull ache of loneliness. That night, as he sat in the darkened living room, he began to reflect on what revenge had cost him. Exposing Vanessa and Rachel had been satisfying in the moment, but the aftermath was isolating. Still, he told himself, they deserved it. A few days later, Daniel received an email from Vanessa. The subject line was simple: an apology. He hesitated before opening it, unsure if he wanted to hear what she had to say. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. The email was long and rambling, filled with regrets and excuses. Vanessa claimed she had been unhappy for years, that the affair with Rachel had been unexpected and confusing. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she wrote. "But I know I did, and for that I am truly sorry." Daniel stared at the words, feeling nothing. He didn't respond. Rachel's attempt to reach out was more direct. She showed up at his office one afternoon, waiting for him in the lobby. "Daniel," she said when he approached, her voice shaking. "Please, can we talk?" Daniel's expression hardened. "There's nothing to talk about." "Please," she repeated, tears pooling in her eyes. "I can't stand this. I know I messed up, but I love you. You're my brother. You loved me?" Daniel's voice was cold. "You had a funny way of showing it." Rachel flinched but pressed on. "I don't know how to fix this, but I'm begging you to give me a chance. I can't lose you." Daniel regarded her for a long moment. Then he said, "You already have." He turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing alone, her sobs echoing in the empty lobby. The weight of their betrayal hung heavy in Daniel's life, but he refused to let it define him. Slowly, he began to rebuild. He spent more time with friends, confiding in Alex and others who supported him. He threw himself into his work, channeling his anger and sadness into productivity. And though the pain didn't vanish, it began to dull, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. But Daniel knew one thing for certain: he would never allow himself to be blindsided again. Time passed, and Daniel began to settle into a new normal. His house, once filled with the echoes of shared laughter and companionship, now felt quieter, but it was a quiet he embraced. He found solace in routine: morning runs, long hours at work, and evenings spent lost in books or movies. The solitude allowed him to reflect, though the scars of betrayal remained vivid. One day, While cleaning the attic, Daniel stumbled upon an old photo album. Dust clung to the edges as he flipped through the pages, revealing snapshots of family gatherings, birthdays, and vacations. There was Rachel as a teenager, grinning in her softball uniform, and Vanessa standing beside him at their wedding, beaming in her white gown. He closed the album abruptly, his chest tightening. These memories were from a life that no longer existed. Despite his efforts to move forward, reminders of the past continued to surface. Vanessa had left the house, but she hadn't vanished entirely. Her lawyer had contacted him several times regarding the divorce proceedings, each interaction reopening old wounds. Rachel, too, made periodic attempts to reconnect. She sent letters, long, handwritten apologies detailing her regret and shame. Daniel read the first few but left the rest unopened in a drawer. He wasn't ready to forgive her, and he wasn't sure he ever would be. One weekend, Alex invited Daniel to a small gathering at his apartment. "You've been cooped up long enough," Alex said over the phone. "Come have a beer and relax." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. The gathering was modest, just a few close friends, music playing softly in the background. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a semblance of ease. He laughed at jokes, sipped his drink, and even joined in a heated debate about the best action movies of all time. At the end of the night, Alex pulled him aside. "You seem better," he said. Daniel nodded. "I think I am. Slowly, but yeah?" Alex hesitated, then asked, "Have you thought about talking to Rachel? Or even Vanessa?" Daniel's smile faded. "Why would I?" "Closure," Alex said simply. "For you, not for them. Carrying this anger around, it's like holding a hot coal. It's only burning you." The words stayed with Daniel long after he left the party. That night, as he lay in bed, he considered the idea of closure. He didn't owe Vanessa or Rachel anything, but perhaps releasing the weight of his anger would help him heal. The next morning, he made a decision. Daniel met Vanessa at a neutral location, a park where they had often walked together during their early years of marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him as he waited on a bench, watching joggers and families pass by. Vanessa arrived late, her appearance subdued. She wore no makeup, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She approached cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly. Daniel nodded but said nothing, his expression unreadable. They sat in silence for a moment before Vanessa spoke. "I've thought about this meeting 100 times. I don't even know where to start." "Start with why?" Daniel said, his voice steady but cold. "Why did you do it?" Vanessa took a shaky breath. "I don't have a good answer. I was unhappy, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't plan for it to happen with Rachel, it just did. I know that doesn't excuse anything." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Unhappy? You couldn't talk to me about that. Instead, you destroyed everything." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I hate myself for it. I've lost everything, Daniel. You, our life together, even Rachel." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Rachel? She cut me off," Vanessa admitted. "After the dinner party we talked, and she said she couldn't face you knowing what we did. She blamed herself for ruining your life and mine." Daniel frowned, his emotions swirling. He had been so focused on his own pain that he hadn't considered how Rachel might be coping with her guilt. The conversation continued, filled with tears and admissions. Vanessa apologized repeatedly, but Daniel made it clear that forgiveness wasn't on the table, not yet. When they parted, Daniel felt lighter, as though a small piece of the weight he carried had been lifted. A few days later, Daniel decided to reach out to Rachel. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, but he knew the silence between them couldn't last forever. He called her, his heart pounding as the phone rang. "Daniel?" Rachel's voice was tentative, almost disbelieving. "It's me," he said. "Can we talk?" Daniel met Rachel at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. He arrived first, choosing a table tucked away in the corner. The cafe was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the gentle hum of conversation. He stirred his drink absent-mindedly, his thoughts racing. When Rachel arrived, she hesitated at the door before spotting him. She looked different, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a nervousness that made her seem smaller. "Hi," she said quietly as she slid into the seat across from him. "Hi," Daniel replied, his voice neutral. For a moment, they sat in awkward silence. Then Rachel spoke, her words spilling out in a rush. "Thank you for meeting me. I didn't think you ever would. I've wanted to talk to you so many times, but I didn't know how to begin, and I'm so sorry, Daniel. For everything. For hurting you, for betraying you. I don't even recognize myself anymore." Daniel held up a hand to stop her. "I didn't come here for apologies, Rachel. I've heard them all before. I came here because—" he hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you're my sister, and as much as I want to hate you, I can't. But I don't know how to move forward from this." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve to move forward. I ruined everything. I ruined us." Daniel sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the moment. "Why, Rachel? Why did you do it? Was it about me? Was it about her? I need to understand." Rachel wiped her eyes, her voice trembling as she answered. "It wasn't about you, Daniel. It was never about you. Vanessa and it started as something stupid, something I didn't think would go anywhere. But then it got complicated. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. I told myself I'd end it, but I didn't, and then it was too late." Daniel's expression hardened. "Too late? It was too late the moment it started. You knew what this would do to me, and you did it anyway." "I know," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. If I could take it all back, I would. But I can't." The raw honesty in her words pierced through Daniel's anger. He didn't want to forgive her. He wasn't sure if he could, but he also didn't want to carry the weight of his resentment forever. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Rachel," he said finally. "But I don't want to hate you anymore. I'm tired of feeling like this." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. Even if it takes the rest of my life." "It might," Daniel said honestly. "But if you're willing to try, I'm willing to meet you halfway. Eventually." They left the cafe with no grand resolutions, no promises of immediate healing. But as Daniel watched Rachel walk away, he felt the smallest flicker of hope that, in time, the fractures in their relationship might begin to heal. Back at home, Daniel reflected on the conversation. He had taken a step toward closure, but there was still so much unresolved. The pain of Vanessa's betrayal, the sting of Rachel's actions, the emptiness left in the wake of their decisions, all of it lingered. He knew healing would be a long process, but for the first time in months, he believed it might be possible. Later that evening, Daniel received a message from Rachel. "Thank you for meeting me. It meant more than you know. I'll keep trying." He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a reply. "We'll see." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days that followed Daniel's meeting with Rachel felt lighter, though the wounds of betrayal still lingered. The edges of his anger were dulling, replaced by a quiet determination to reclaim his life. While forgiveness was far off, he allowed himself to feel the smallest glimmer of hope that fractured relationships might one day be mended. But the past had a way of resurfacing. One evening, as Daniel sifted through unopened mail, he came across an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a plain font. "You think you know everything, but there's more to the story. Meet me if you want the truth. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Forest Lane Diner. Come alone." Daniel's pulse quickened. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a cruel prank, but the vagueness gnawed at him. What truth could remain, after everything that had already been exposed? Against his better judgment, curiosity won. The following evening, Daniel arrived at the Forest Lane Diner, a dimly lit establishment that seemed frozen in time. He scanned the room but saw no familiar faces. As he waited, his unease grew. Finally, A man approached his table, a tall figure with a lean build and piercing eyes. He looked vaguely familiar, though Daniel couldn't place him. "You're Daniel, right?" the man asked, sliding into the booth without waiting for an invitation. "Who are you?" Daniel replied, his tone guarded. "My name's Colin," the man said, leaning forward. "You don't know me, but I know Vanessa and Rachel." Daniel's stomach churned. "What do you mean you know them?" Colin smirked, though his expression carried no malice. "Vanessa wasn't as loyal to me as she was to you. Let's just say I was part of her extracurricular activities." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He stared at Colin, trying to process what he'd just heard. "You're lying," he said, his voice low. "Am I?" Colin replied, raising an eyebrow. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through pictures until he found what he was looking for. He slid the device across the table. Daniel hesitated before looking. The image showed Vanessa and Colin together, laughing and embracing in what was unmistakably a hotel room. "It wasn't just me either," Colin continued. "Vanessa had a pattern. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you deserve to know the full story." Daniel's hands clenched into fists under the table. He felt a surge of emotions, anger, betrayal, and an odd sense of relief that his suspicions had been validated, even if the truth was more devastating than he'd imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I've been where you are," Colin said, his tone sincere. "I've been lied to, cheated on, and left in the dark. When I found out about Vanessa's other entanglements, I wanted answers. I figured you might want them too." Daniel didn't respond. He stared at the table, his mind racing. "I'll leave you to it," Colin said, standing up. "But if you want to know more, here's my number." He slid a card across the table before walking out of the diner, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Colin's revelation had reopened old wounds and introduced new ones. He thought back to his relationship with Vanessa, dissecting every moment, every conversation, searching for signs he might have missed. How many lies had she told? How much of their life together had been real? The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't going to let Vanessa's betrayals define him any longer, but he needed to confront her one final time to lay everything to rest. He sent her a message. "We need to talk. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. My house." Her reply came quickly. "I'll be there." When Vanessa arrived the next day, she looked nervous, her hands clutching her bag tightly. Daniel wasted no time. "Who's Colin?" he asked, his tone sharp. Vanessa's face paled. "Where did you hear that name?" "Answer the question," Daniel said, his voice rising. Vanessa hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if considering an escape. Finally she sighed. "He was someone I saw before Rachel. It was a mistake, Daniel. I swear, it didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" Daniel repeated bitterly. "How many others didn't mean anything, Vanessa? How many lies did you tell me?" Vanessa began to cry, but Daniel felt no sympathy. "Don't," he said coldly. "I'm done being lied to. I'm done being manipulated. You and Rachel, you've both taken enough from me. But no more. This ends here." Vanessa tried to plead with him, but Daniel refused to engage further. When she left, he felt an overwhelming sense of finality. For the first time in months, he felt free. The confrontation with Vanessa marked a turning point for Daniel. Her tears, her excuses, and her admissions no longer had the power to break him. Instead, they solidified his resolve to move forward, a path he would carve on his own terms. He spent the next few weeks focusing on himself. He decluttered the house, removing objects that tied him to a life that no longer existed. Vanessa's belongings, long forgotten in the spare room, were packed and donated. He rearranged furniture, painted the walls, and even replaced their old bed with one he chose himself. In the evenings, Daniel found peace in small rituals. He began journaling, pouring his thoughts onto paper in a way he never had before. It wasn't just about anger or sadness, it was about rediscovering who he was beyond the betrayals. He also joined a local hiking group. The camaraderie of strangers, the fresh air, and the physical exertion worked wonders for his mood. On those trails, surrounded by towering trees and open skies, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. Despite the progress, there were moments of weakness. One night, after a long hike, Daniel returned home to find a voicemail from Rachel. Her voice was shaky, but her words were clear. "Daniel, I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness. I wanted to tell you how proud I am of you. Alex told me about the hiking group and how you're moving forward. I know I don't deserve to say this, but I'm glad you're finding your way. You deserve that." Daniel listened to the message twice before deleting it. He didn't call her back, but a small part of him appreciated the gesture. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life continued to take shape. He grew closer to his friends, especially Alex, who had been his rock throughout the ordeal. One evening, over beers at Alex's apartment, the topic of trust came up. "Do you think you'll ever date again?" Alex asked cautiously. Daniel laughed, though it lacked humor. "Not anytime soon. I've got enough baggage to fill a storage unit." "Everyone's got baggage," Alex said. "The right person will help you carry it." Daniel shrugged, unconvinced. "Maybe. But I'm not in a rush. For now, I'm just focusing on me." One unexpected day, Rachel showed up unannounced at Daniel's door. She looked hesitant, holding a small box in her hands. "I'm sorry for coming without calling," she said quickly. I wanted to give you this." Daniel hesitated but stepped aside, letting her in. Rachel placed the box on the table. "These are some things from when we were kids, photos, letters, stuff you gave me over the years. I thought maybe you'd want them." Daniel opened the box, his breath catching as he saw the contents. A picture of the two of them at the beach, Rachel laughing as a younger Daniel held a bucket of seashells. A crumpled birthday card he made for her when he was 10, the words scrawled in uneven handwriting. He looked up at her, unsure what to say. "I know I can't fix what I did," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "But I want you to know that I haven't stopped trying to be better. For you. For myself." Daniel nodded slowly. "Thank you for this. It means something." That small exchange didn't repair their relationship, but it planted a seed of understanding. Rachel left with a tearful smile, and Daniel felt, for the first time, that there might be a future where they could coexist without the shadow of betrayal hanging over them. As the seasons changed, so did Daniel's perspective. He no longer thought of himself as a victim, but as someone who had survived. The betrayals that had once defined his life now felt like chapters in a book, a painful story, but one that had ultimately led him to rediscover his own strength. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood on a mountaintop with his hiking group, the world stretching out before him. The wind whipped around him, carrying away the last remnants of his anger and sorrow. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the moment wash over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was at peace. The months that followed Daniel's rediscovery of peace were marked by slow, steady progress. There was no magic moment of sudden healing. Rather, it was a series of small, intentional steps that led him to a place of clarity and self-assurance. The pain, while never fully gone, became more like a scar, a reminder of what he had endured and the strength it had taken to survive. Daniel's life began to take on a new rhythm. He continued with his hiking group, growing more confident with each step, not just on the trails but in his personal life. He reconnected with old friends, shared meals with them, laughed, and enjoyed the kind of companionship that had once felt so distant. He even started to entertain the idea of dating again, though it remained a tentative thought, one he wasn't ready to act on just yet. But there was one thing that began to weigh on him, the question of his relationship with his sister, Rachel. While they had reached a sort of unspoken truce, a tentative peace between them, the bond they once shared felt irreparably broken. He couldn't deny that a part of him longed for the closeness they had before the betrayal, but the other part, the part that had learned to be cautious, knew that some wounds were too deep to simply stitch over with time. One evening, as he was walking back from the park, Daniel received an unexpected call. It was Rachel. "Hey," she said, her voice unsure, but with an edge of hope in it. "Can we meet? I've been thinking about us, about everything. And I know it's a lot to ask, but I think we need to talk." Daniel hesitated. It had been months since they last saw each other. He had moved on, or at least he had thought he had. But deep down, a part of him had always wondered if they could ever truly heal the fracture between them. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow, 4 p.m. Same cafe as last time?" "Yeah," Rachel replied, a smile evident in her voice. "I'll be there." The next day, Daniel arrived early, taking a seat at the same corner booth they had shared months ago. The cafe, as always, smelled of fresh coffee, the atmosphere quiet and comfortable. When Rachel arrived, she looked different, older somehow, but also more composed. She had done her part to work on herself, just as she had promised. Daniel noticed it immediately, the absence of the self-doubt and guilt that had weighed her down before. "Hey," she greeted, her voice soft but steady. "Hey," Daniel replied, offering a small smile. They sat in silence for a few moments, neither of them rushing to speak. There was a certain calmness to the moment, the quiet acknowledgement that they had both come a long way. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about us, Daniel. About what I did, about what I lost. And I know I can't change the past. I can't fix what I broke. But I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was. I've learned. I've changed." Daniel nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know you've changed, Rachel. I've seen it. But it's not just about changing, is it? It's about whether or not we can rebuild trust. Whether or not we can be who we were to each other before." Rachel looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her napkin. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight. And I don't expect everything to go back to how it was. But I need you to know that I'm here now. For you. And I hope, one day, we can get back to that place. If you'll allow me to prove it." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel looked at his sister, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her not as the person who had betrayed him, but as the person she was becoming. The person she wanted to be. And he realized, in that moment, that he was willing to try. Not for her. Not for anyone else. But for himself. "I'm not promising that it'll be easy," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet vulnerability. "But I'm willing to give us a chance. A real chance. Let's see where it takes us." Rachel's face broke into a relieved smile, the tension in her shoulders easing. She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered over his. "Thank you. I'll never take that for granted." Daniel smiled back. "Don't. Just be here, Rachel. That's all I need." As they parted ways that afternoon, something shifted between them, a quiet understanding that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but rather learning to live with it and moving forward in a healthier, more honest way. And while the road ahead wasn't certain, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. In the days that followed, Daniel began to feel the full weight of what it meant to truly rebuild, rebuilding trust, yes, but also rebuilding himself. He no longer clung to anger or revenge. He no longer needed validation from others to feel whole. The world, once darkened by betrayal, now seemed full of possibility. There was light ahead. A new beginning, waiting to be claimed. And so, as the seasons continued to change, Daniel embraced his new life, not one without scars, but one where those scars had become part of his story, part of who he was. With the promise of peace in his heart and hope for the future, he moved forward, step by step, knowing that no matter what happened, he was no longer a victim of his circumstances. He was the author of his own life.